stop all aid to those countries, and that we should reformulate. I'm not saying leave in terms of cut and run from a military standpoint, but reformulate our goals and our deployment in those countries so that we are restricting jihad activity and making sure that jihadist groups cannot plan and cannot train and cannot carry out their plans. But otherwise, the idea of trying to establish democracy in those countries only leads to more Islamic law, which leads to more jihad against the West.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Samuel Settle, Penn State. Thank you very much for speaking to us. You mentioned Geert Wilders in the Netherlands and his party, the Party for Freedom. They've put forward a very comprehensive plan to stop the Islamization of the Netherlands that includes labeling violent parts of the Quran as hate speech, putting strict limitations on Islamic immigration. I wanted to know, first, what do you think of their program for the Netherlands, and what parts of it, if any, do you think we should be looking to implement here in the United States?
Well, when you talk about restricting parts of the Quran as hate speech, obviously I'm against all hate speech laws. Geert Wilders is working in a in the United States, you know, as classically constituted, we have freedom of speech, and that ought to be freedom of speech. That ought to be the idea that bad ideas are chased out by better ones, not by repression. Geert Wilders is a great warrior for freedom and ought to be supported by all of us to every extent that we can. He has called for a banning of the Quran in the Netherlands. It's a very different context in the first place because they do ban books in the Netherlands. And he has noted that they have banned Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler's book, which is certainly hate speech. And if you're going to ban hate speech, then Wilders says you have to be consistent about it. And if the Quran exhorts warfare against unbelievers and the oppression of them, then if the Dutch government is going to be consistent, it ought to ban it as well. But while I understand the logic of that position, I'm grateful that we're not in that situation here, and we don't have laws like that, and I hope we don't get them. So in that sense, I understand and sympathize with his position, but I don't support it as such in bringing it here, simply because we don't have laws like that, and we shouldn't. And Europe is wrong to have them. Secondly, in terms of immigration, the great difficulty is this, that there are millions of Muslims who are not waging jihad against the West. That's undisputable fact. And it is also an undisputable fact that the Islamic jihad groups treat those Muslims as kind of a large recruiting pool. And they go into Muslim communities and they appeal to them on the basis of being true Islam, the pure Muslims, which is how they present themselves. And they say, if you want to get back to the true understanding of the religion, you got to go with us. And you have guys like the very secular Muslims who make up what is called the Lackawanna Six. Six young men from New York who are now in prison for plotting to join up with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and fight against American troops a few years back. Now, how is it that some young men who grew up in New York in a very secular environment ended up doing that? Because a Saudi recruiter came and he appealed to them and he said, look, you're living in sin, you know, you're drinking alcohol, you're doing these other things that are against Islam. And Islam doesn't have a confessional booth. The best way to make sure that your good deeds outweigh your bad ones is to do a very good deed. And Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, said the best deed you can do is jihad. So he convinced them that the way they could redress their balance and get into the good graces of God was to wage jihad. In other words, he appealed to their Islamic understandings and their Islamic loyalties, which they had even though they were secular Muslims, that nobody would have thought would pose any threat to the United States. And so we have to look at that realistically, that when we bring in these people from Muslim countries, there's no effort made whatsoever right now to determine their loyalties, to determine their perspectives. So at very least, if we're not going to restrict immigration, which I think would just be prudent from a national security standpoint, but it's so fraught with other issues, if we're not going to do that, we should at least make it very clear that any agitation for any element of Sharia in the United States is grounds for deportation. And that's just a first step.
Thank you.
Salam alaikum, Mr. Spencer. In the most ironic way possible, my husband is Muslim. What can we say to the useful idiots in the West, many of whom I find are Christians, who have bought into what is essentially the Islamic lie that Christians, Jews, and Muslims all worship the same God?
Well, one would wonder in the first place, what's the point of pointing that out? You know, what is the person who points it out trying to say? If Christians, Jews, and Muslims worship the same God, if we grant it for the sake of argument for a moment, then what does that mean? Does that mean that Islamic jihadists are not waging war to subjugate us under the rule of Islamic law? I mean, in the first place, it's apples and oranges, you see. It doesn't follow. Even if we did worship the same God, then there is still this jihadist and supremacist imperative within Islam. Second, it's a little bit of a clouded issue because we worship the God of the same name. The Arabic-speaking Christians with whom I'm in daily contact use the word Allah for God, and they mean the God of the Bible, not the God of the Quran. And this confuses some people who speak exclusively of Allah as the God of Islam. It's a little bit more complicated than that. At the same time, if you read the Quran and you read the Bible, there's no doubt that they're not the same guy. You have in the Quran many repeated, insistent assertions that Allah has no son, and that it is an insult to the transcendent majesty of God to say that he has a son. And of course, in the New Testament, you have the contrary assertion that anybody who does not have the Son does not have the Father. And so those two things cannot both be true. They might both be false, but they can't both be true. And so just from a logical standpoint, it's clear that we do not all worship the same God.
Thank you.
Kid Elliott, Panetta Institute. These days, I'm beginning to think that we cannot rely primarily on bullets to defeat radical jihadists, only because it seems to turn them into martyrs and spur them to fight harder and boost recruitment. And so I'm beginning to think maybe we should use a more clandestine approach, such as injecting a little bit of pop culture into their society to sort of, you know, de-radicalize them and maybe secularize them. So in that sense, then, is perhaps our best weapon against radical Islam Justin Timberlake and Dave Chappelle, let's say?
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that, because it's already happening. And there's a very interesting thesis, as a matter of fact, being advanced by some others. I very strongly disagree with this, but it's really kind of the flip side of what you're saying. Some people have actually suggested that the whole Islamic Jihad was caused by Britney Spears, that essentially the introduction of the American pop culture in all its rottenness and immorality into the Islamic world made these moral and straight-laced people in the Islamic world lash out by taking down the Twin Towers. That's preposterous in many ways, most notably because the jihad was going on long before American pop culture was rotten. Sayyid Qutb, who's one of the foremost theorists of the modern-day jihad, who was a 20th century Egyptian, he came and he actually lived in the United States in Greeley, Colorado for 2 years in the 40s. And he went to a church social where there was a little dance going on. And he was so scandalized by this dancing that he wrote a very revealing document about how absolutely immoral and rotten American popular culture was, and that it was important to wage jihad against it. Now, that was Doris Day he was upset about. Imagine what he would think of Christina Aguilera. So it's in the first place, the claim that the West is immoral has always been a staple of jihadist discourse ever since even the Crusades. It is not the reason why they're fighting us, but ultimately the strategy you propose is very much in full swing, and it ultimately doesn't work, I'm sorry to say. One final anecdotal evidence to illustrate how it doesn't work is the kidnapping of Charles Glass, who is an American journalist who in the late 80s, for some unaccountable reason, decided it would be really neat to walk from Antioch in southern Turkey to Cairo in Egypt. And along the way, rather predictably, in Lebanon, he was kidnapped by Hezbollah.